Hello, my name is Quaid. This is What's Your Argument? Today I am here with Spirit Man. Oh, I think I'm getting some feedback, Spirit Man. Oh, sorry about that. Um, yeah, this is What's Your Argument? I'm here with Spirit Man or Mark. I believe you can find him in several locations under Spirit Man, but if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself or give any information, Mark.
Welcome, guys. Hello. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, but I hope you can hear me. My name is Mark McCormick. My social media is under Spirit Man, and I'm still getting a little bit of feedback from somewhere. Let's do that. Sorry about that. I'm on a bit of a passionate journey to see if we can introduce a new kind of world spirit. And I'm very happy to be on Street Epistemologists. I've heard about you guys twice from two different sources over the last couple of weeks as I try and network. And people are holding you in high regard. So I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity to kind of spread this new version of genuine philosophy. And I hope we can get right into it and answer all your questions. And if it inspires the heart and minds of your audience or anybody who watches this, that is the point. That is the spirit.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it. So I guess with that, we'll jump right in then. I was going to ask you about hobbies and stuff, but it sounds like you're passionate about talking about this thing. So I think we should just get right into it. I guess one initial question that I have for you is how familiar you are with street epistemology?
Not very. Of course, I know what epistemology is, but I was giving these sessions, or I'm still giving them actually, on they're called Sessions of Spirit on Hegel. And one of the guys who was attracted to my talks came in and said, Mark, what you're doing is really profound in terms of the way we dialogue. You're teaching this kind of sort of Socratic dialogue, this dialectic. And he says, you need to find out about these guys called the street epistemologists. And normally those two words don't go together, right? Because epistemology is usually ivory tower and, academic philosophies, and it's a long word. And then to have street in front of it, it's a nice juxtaposition where it's like we're bringing it down to earth to actually show that everybody can engage in rational thinking, philosophical arguments to get to the real truth and sort of address this problem where we're in a world where we're not sure what the truth is half the time. And the internet seems to be exacerbating that. So this return to wisdom, this return to finding the facts and thinking about thinking is kind of why he pointed me in your direction, because you guys are amazing at this at basically all levels. So that's all I've kind of heard so far. And I saw you guys do, I guess I saw you work your magic in the last session when I got on. And so I was really impressed. So that's basically where I'm picking up.
All right, great. That was such a great description. Yeah, I think a lot of SEers would agree with that description. The juxtaposition, this idea of epistemology being knowledge, but kind of this thing that's seen as inaccessible to people who are just, regular everyday people, and really kind of pushing against that idea and saying these are conversations anybody could have. I think, yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah. So I do want to address your claim here. I wrote it down. And you can let me know if this is still it or if it's been modified anyway. But the idea is basically we can change the world and introduce a new world spirit in 26 days if we introduced Hegel's science of logic for this God coherence that I'm guessing he talks about. That is okay. All right. One initial question would be, how long have you had this belief? If you had to estimate maybe, or maybe know the exact day.
The day that I met you, the 26 days. I have 26 days before I basically run out of food and money that I budgeted to last about 10 weeks to get this going. And so September 1st is where I'm going to get a job if we can't raise a lot of money to keep going forward with this at the rate that I'm going now, just blazing a trail. So when I saw you guys, it was exactly 26 days, I think, from September 1st. And so I decided that, if these guys are operating on this kind of level and are interested in this kind of truth, I think there's going to be an immediate connection. And so I believe that if I do a good enough job communicating what I learned from Hegel and metaphysical dialectic, that we could probably create a bridge, because the street epistemology is about building these bridges of truth. And I think that part of that has to do with testing the assertions. And if there's truth and real universality to what I'm about to say, then it should spark something, like it should go exponential in our networks. But we'll see. We'll see if I do. It depends on how well I understand and I'm clear on the universals that I picked up in Hegel. So if it doesn't happen, it's because I guess I'm not quite ready. And then I'll have to improve after this. And I have a funny feeling you're going to have a lot of suggestions on how.
Could be, could be. Okay, so the next question, this is just very typical of street epistemology. From 0 to 100%, how confident would you say that you are that the claim is true?
I guess it depends on how clear I feel I am. Because the clearer we are as philosophers, the more our practical spirit, our intentions align with our goals, our ends. So the ability to manifest what we want sort of seems to depend on our own wisdom and ability to engage with real reality, to position and align ourselves with the actual facts to bring about something that doesn't yet exist. So I would say that I'm pretty confident in my Hegel knowledge that, at least I'm at a world standard, like world-class scholarship, if not one step above. But I still have quite a bit more to learn. Hegel, of course, is this sort of like infinite well that just keeps getting deeper. But I would probably say, with where we're at and what I saw from you guys, I would say that there's probably a, let's say, 80%, 90% chance that I could probably pull this off. So let's see if I'm right. And if anything, it's going to be anti-fragile, because you'll be able to see what I'm missing maybe, and then it's just improving. So I'm interested to see what you guys say after this.
So does that 80 to 90% correspond to your confidence level, how confident you are?
Yeah, that's something that an improvement's going to happen, where in 26 days it could lead to the beginnings of planting these seeds to a new world spirit. So that could mean starting up something new. That could be accelerating street epistemology to a new level. That could be jumping off these sessions of spirit, maybe getting them sent out to, I don't know, the street, of course, getting our street philosophers on board, but also maybe the sort of Ivy Leagues on board who are paying attention to you guys, or paying attention to me on academia.edu. I think we need to get the sort of like academic and the grassroots growing at the same time. And so I'm pretty certain that if we do this right, we can basically get those both going in a meaningful way.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. There are some words and phrases that I think I need to find. So bear with me here. I will also be taking notes as well. So excuse me if it just takes me a little bit longer to respond. But so in your claim, the idea of changing the world, I know that you were talking a little bit about this on the live call-in show, but I'm wondering if you could kind of elaborate more on that, or be more specific in terms of what you mean by changing the world. How do you imagine the world changing, in what ways, so on and so forth?
In a couple of words, it's just new world spirit. That's what we're aiming for. But of course, the loaded question is, well, what is spirit, right? And this is where Hegel comes in, and a new kind of philosophy comes in that doesn't exist in the world today. And I wasn't always a big Hegel guy. People will say, well, this guy's, he only reads one philosopher. He's like a narrow-minded, kind of methodology. I use that kind of methodology. But the reality is, it took me about 20 years to get into Hegel. I started very young looking for the truth, because I was born on the poverty line in Canada, and I couldn't understand, as a kind of sensitive child, why I was going through this kind of experience when I was seeing other people having an easier time. And my mother is my saving grace. I think she's the reason why we basically survived all of that, and held, stayed in one piece, kept the inner child alive to want to search for the truth, keep that inner wonder going. That's crucial to real philosophy. But I started a long time ago questioning the nature of reality. And I ended up looking up, religions, New Age philosophy, even Buddhism and Christianity. And then I got into physics, and then I got into quantum physics, and then I got into formal philosophy, went to university, Then I did a bunch of activism, and basically what it came down to was reading Hegel after reading Kant, like hundreds, thousands of philosophers and sources of wisdom, Alan Watts, everything. I looked everywhere for this, and I finally came across Hegel after 3 attempts of trying to read him. So the first time I ignored him. The second time I kind of ignored him, thinking that he's just an obscure philosopher trying to sound smart. But the third time I came across him was in a weird synchronicity where I was actually in love with a woman, and what he had said about my situation, like I just read a paragraph and it resonated so deeply with what I was going through. I was like, whoa, what if the whole thing was like this? There was like an echo, and it caused me to take him seriously. And when I did, I found out that he actually summed up 115 of the greatest philosophical, religious, spiritual, mystical, scientific minds of the last 3,000 years in one system. He didn't just paraphrase them. He actually distilled their core principles and then grew them into each other because he understood them so profoundly. And so what I mean by world spirit is that we have to develop this kind of philosophy that he did, where instead of negating each other, instead of trying to one-up each other, you actually do something called sublation. And sublation is what real refutation is, epistemologically. It's the process of knowledge that moves in a living way, where you at first create a first negation that creates a separation and opposition, where it looks like the truth isn't shared, and then you negate that negation, you find the truth in both sides, you cancel the limit, and you transcend to a higher level that is a concrete unity of those first two as moments, ideal moments where you can move freely amongst them, and your reasoning can travel in the full spectrum of the truth. But the interesting thing is Hegel didn't just do that for 1 or 2 principles of philosophy. He did that for everything. And he built it so that it circled back on itself in a complete sort of self-rationalizing, self-justifying model that I think is real science, what he calls infinite science, that we don't have today. And real spirit is the thinking in this capacity that allows you to find the truth in anything, that allows you to self-recognize with anything, to bring the ideal out and kind of leave aside the falsity or the limit. So it's kind of like making the world beautiful again by purifying it with this new level of clarity that comes with genuine philosophical thinking and this living way of being, this living spirit of philosophy that is allowed to self-correct. It's allowed to ask the hard questions, question dogma, but also get to the essence of things. So I hope that kind of answers your question. We have to build that kind of mentality. Hegel is teaching us a state of mind that was in dialectic with our being. So your thinking is your being in the world, but your being in the world also influences your thinking. And he says, if you do this right, it will empower your spirit to literally introduce new universals, new truths into the world to create a new world spirit everywhere. That's kind of what I mean by changing the world. And it will change our institutions, our governments. Everything is connected in this living way. So once you do it, fundamentally, it changes the whole thing. And then you really are in a new way of life.
Okay, all right. So you mentioned this change in institutions and governments. Could you maybe pinpoint what exactly you think will change about the government or institutions?
So it sounds funny, but basically all the conflicts in the world today, including political conflicts, are all based on how we dialogue with each other, how we communicate with each other. All of our problems are just from the minds of human beings. Boulders, rocks, water, they don't really care. They're just following their mechanical dialectic, the laws of physics, right? But we're sort of this deeper logic that's reflecting on itself. And when we try and share information, there's a sort of misunderstanding that's happening where we see each other as opposites. We see each other as, self and other, enemies. And that moment of separation, that abstract negation, is basically what we are by default. So Hegel says that this way the world works, it's all one logic, and it operates in an abstract negation, and then it negates itself. It's just negation over and over again. A self-reflexive negation, that's sublation, that is this transcendence of the negation, but then the negation just starts up again and creates another separation. So what we are as thinking beings is really just this first negation coming through, and it creates a separation so that we can know something that's not us. If there's no contrast, you can't know anything. It's indeterminate. So to have determinate knowledge, things you can actually think through for yourself, you have to have a separation at first. And then the negation, the separation, is reintegrated back into you by that sublation. You find the truth in it and its limit that creates the clarity. And then the other actually becomes a part of you again, but it's an other that is no other. And you're just doing this over and over and over again. Our political systems are operating in this default mode only. So we're all negating each other explicitly. We know that we're kind of doing this, but we don't know an alternative. We don't know that there's something called sublation logically. So this is the fundamental thing, the fundamental logical piece that I think is missing across the whole world at all levels of our societal structure, right down to the ontological and epistemological, right down to the foundations of philosophy and wisdom itself. I think if we made explicit this other thing that we're doing it implicitly all the time. You're always negating and sublating. You're always negating and sublating, but we're not explicit about that relationship. And I think that if we teach that, it will correct the process of our thinking into a higher wisdom, where when we go into a political discourse, we know what the dialectics are. We know what the crux of the issue is, and we don't get stuck in that abstract negative moment where we're enemies. And we always look for that sublation. We always look for this sort of faith that the world is rational, and you can find the truth on both sides. Then you can kind of go down to the next level, and you can find it in the family, the tensions in the family life. Those can be sublated too. You can go one step deeper, and you can get into morality. You can get into abstract legal status, Hegel calls it. You can keep going down. All the dialectics are sort of stacked on top of each other, and you can go down and start sublating them in this new way. But you have to know what sublation is, and that's a mental thing. That's a soft, squishy thing that most people don't think is important, but is actually the source of all our problems. We don't understand the nature of ourselves. We don't know thyself enough to tap into what our true power is in the world of pure thought. We are pure thought coming through the sensuous world, and because we don't understand that nature, we're misusing it. We're not able to align with our true wisdom. And Hegel gives us the fuller, concrete understanding of who we are, so that when we engage with the other, we're not going to get stuck in this negative moment of reason. We're actually going to start looking for immediately this sublation.
Okay, so I think I'm starting to piece some things together here. One thing that I'm wondering, so in this world where there's a new world spirit, and people understand themselves as pure thoughts, is the idea here that there's not going to be like any war in this world?
Yeah.
Or
So
okay, so that would be one of the things that would change about the world.
yeah, I think we have to be careful with this word war. But I think that the way we've taught Hegel for the last 200 years is fundamentally the reason why he hasn't introduced a new world spirit. His philosophy hasn't actually achieved what Hegel says it's supposed to achieve, which is that philosophy is not just supposed to be theoretical. It's supposed to be practical. It's supposed to change the world with that wisdom. But the way we've been teaching Hegel, now that I've read him for about 3,000 hours directly, is that there's this concept of pain and suffering that Hegel's famous for, and everybody teaches him this way. He says there's something called the slaughter bench of history, and you can't get away from it. If you try to, you're just being naive. Life is about suffering. It's about negation. Hegel's called the negative philosopher. And it's true for the first half of his philosophy. That's exactly what it is. It's just this churning, this abstract negation that sublates into another painful moment, and it just keeps doing that. But the trick is that you have to read Hegel long enough to see the whole movement. Most people get burnt out because of the way Hegel writes. It's so dense that most people don't get past that first negation, that first slaughter bench moment. But there's a progress going on in history, and Hegel says it's the progress of world spirit, that through every war, and a war is just that first moment of abstract negation. It's like one society against another society, and they're clashing with this pure thought in the background underneath, animating things. And they're really just working out ideas. What is the truth? What is the truth of the world? But they don't know they're doing that yet. They're just thinking they're grasping their material needs, and they're just trying to have a good time, and these people are preventing them from doing that. So Hegel says that actually what's going on underneath the contingency of history is that there's a progress going on to purify our relationship to each other, and that we aren't standing still. It's actually getting more and more blessed. It's getting more and more rational as history goes through. Each war is actually either ending up in a nullity, in a cancellation where nothing happens, or it can end up in that positive moment of reason, a sublation into a higher rational state. Of course, the negation starts up again. Yes, that's true. You can't get rid of the negation. So these people that call Hegel a negative philosopher, that's what they're focusing on, is that, yeah, you can't get rid of that first abstract negation, because sublation, this kind of mystical awesomeness, this universal move, incorporates that first negation. You need that first negation to negate it, to have that negation of negation to that higher level, right? So it's naive to try and get rid of that first negation. But what I found out is that that doesn't mean violence all the time. Negation doesn't have to mean violence or suffering or war. It can just mean a difference. So as reason becomes more and more explicit to itself through us as world spirit, the nature of that negation starts to change. So in the beginning, it's very animalistic and brutal. What's not me, I just kill and I eat it, basically. That's what animals are trapped in. But then we sublate that into human consciousness, but only at first implicit reason. We know there's an object there and we're thinking about it, but it's not really a rational object yet. It is rational implicitly, but we don't think on that rational level. We evolve through this process of negations until the negations become just the process of self-discovery. So it doesn't have to be a war. It's like, oh, you see
Okay.
something you don't understand, right? Well, what do? You don't have to destroy it. You can actually now realize, wait a second, there might be something in there that I can understand, and it's going to teach me about who I am. And when you incorporate the meta, that epistemological meta thinking, that's what science is. It's a more
Hmm.
blessed way of having that negation reincorporate into you faster, less violently, but you're still having the difference. So you can actually determine who you are still. That's why Hegel says the ultimate, most amazing, ideal state, government, is a rational one. But he doesn't mean rationality in the way we have it today. It's an abstract rationality that we have today. It's chopped up in bits, which is why we still have so much conflict. We're fragmented in our reasoning. He says, no, there's one universal reason which connects all those reasonings together in one logic. And if you grasp that, you can negate and sublate anything in any area
Okay.
of life. And so this
All right.
is what we need to build the state on, is this idea that the negation becomes more blessed as you become more rational as a genuine philosopher.
Okay, yeah, I'm understanding some of this, and I think that some of what you're saying will resonate with people. I think I don't want to do it right now, but ultimately I want to come back to this this idea of specifically negation and sublation. I think are going to be things that people aren't going to fully understand, that are going to need explained in depth. But I think in terms of the conversation we're having right now, I think the idea is that there will still be problems. They just won't be the problems we have now, or they won't be as violent or physical. That fair to say? Is that what all this boils down to? So if we can kind of adopt this or create this atmosphere of a new world spirit, that things like war, or uh, basically maybe we'll call like violent crimes, just won't really be a thing anymore, though we'll still have other problems. Is that how we can
Well,
expect the world to change based off of this?
yeah, so the low level violence, the low level type of problems, those will be gone. But our new problems, well, they won't really be seen as problems. They're going to be invited in, because what you
Okay.
don't know becomes the source of novelty. And as you start to approach all knowingness, it starts to get, if you don't keep growing, it starts to get stale. And Hegel says you start to die, you lose the life. And so we will start to invite in these problems, right? But they will be seen as like novelty. We're discovering new things. We're the pioneers of, the universe. And it's our pure curiosity, our wonderment about the world, that is going to lead us to look for those problems, because that's kind of the point of life as you get to know yourself.
Okay.
And that's kind of what spirit is. The whole point of spirit, the whole purpose of it, Hegel says, his entire philosophy, the whole point is what he calls genuine freedom. And genuine freedom is this process of self-recognition and self-discovery in the world until you are one with that world in this kind of harmony. and what is other to you is immediately sublated back into yourself as this integration that happens a lot more quickly, smoothly, in this absolute kind of wisdom.
Okay, yeah, I think I definitely understand now what you mean by a change in the world. I'm grasping some of this. I don't know if people in the audience are, so I might try to re-explain this in my own words and see if that hits some things. Um, Spirit, you have talked about, and I'm trying to think of a way to ask about this word spirit. Like,
Mhm.
I think, maybe I have a question around, is the spirit something that um, exists but isn't physical?
That's a great question. Hegel defines it as a kind of double meaning. He says it's um, Geist, which is spirit or mind. So
Hmm.
yes, the mind we don't typically see as physical, but it's linked to the physical world. But it's this supersensuousness Hegel calls pure thought. So our internal world is actually a kind of reuniting, a returning to uh, this world that's immanent within the sensuous world, but they're actually distinct. So it's transcendental, but it's also immanent. And we at first start at low levels of realizing pure thought, but as we become more rational, we become more aware of that pure thought world, where there's this ultimate epistemological model of truth finding that's based on coherence. And you experience that coherence when you make these dialectical, these kind of truth connections that are actually logical and line up with the real world. They correspond to the real world, but they also cohere with themselves in this supersensuous realm that's immanent and driving things in this world. So he says that spirit is like mind. You can think about it like mind, but when we think about mind secularly, it's missing this concreteness, this totality. You don't really usually think of world mind when you think of the mind. We just think about our individual subjectivities, our individual minds. But he says spirit is this kind of more religious word, but he wants to keep it because it has this connotation that he thinks is absolutely necessary for genuine philosophy to kind of emerge into the world. And it's that there's this totality to it where we're all a part of it. And so spirit is like world mind. And
Okay.
what we need to do is it kind of exists in the world, but you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't taste it, but you can think it. And that's why it's an interconnection between people that we can try and verbalize with our mouths, stuff like this, sensuous symbols, but it itself is super sensuous. It's coming through this world of materiality, and we can see it in imperfect forms, like Plato said, but in itself, it's like this perfect reason that we're we think that we're sort of maybe creating it as subjective minds, but it's also a discovery. It's a reuniting with who we really are inside of ourselves in this kind of circle. That might be a lot
Okay.
to take in, but for the people that are more curious
Yeah.
about this, I'm hoping that it's triggering some bells.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand some of the things that you're saying, but the details are still lost to me. I would say. I think another question I might have that may clear some of this up, or maybe it won't. But do you think that the spirit one day will be like measurable, like like in terms of quantity? Do you think we'll be able to quantify the spirit one day?
So now I think we're getting into falsifiability to check to see if we have the truth. Is this stuff real or not? And this is where Hegel is incredible, and this is what I think he has done that nobody else in history in the last 3,000 years, whether it's Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Heraclitus, the Neoplatonists, the Stoics, Descartes, Leibniz, like nobody I don't think has done this, but Hegel does provide a standard to check to see if this realm of spirit is actually a real thing that can be checked and tested for truth claims. And that thing he gives us is the science of logic. Now, Hegel's system has three parts to it. And he calls these three parts his entire system. He says real philosophy has to be scientific, which means systematic. And he says his entire system is called the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, and it starts with logic. It starts with his science of logic. But then the logic develops itself into nature, the philosophy of nature. And then nature develops itself into the final part, which is the philosophy of spirit. But the philosophy of spirit, once it develops itself, circles back around to the logic and completes itself in a systematic loop that is self-justifying. It means there's nothing that's needed outside of it. The logic and the method of the logic is in itself, which sounds like a paradox, but it's the ultimate thing that we're missing in terms of philosophy and epistemology today. But this realm of logic can be checked on. And he says the way you check on something that's super sensuous, like you can't touch it, how do you do it then? You do it in pure thought, logically. He says this new type of logic is universal. It's not you thinking it, it thinks itself. And if you get rid of all your biases, then you can watch it develop itself scientifically, objectively. And he says, we never think, this is the crazy part, guys. We never think to question the truth of our own thought categories, like being, something, other, finitude, the syllogism. These things that we use to interpret the world are so immanent to us, so fundamental, that we never even think that they themselves can be false or true. And Hegel says they can. They are themselves scientific. And he says the way to prove it is by showing the logical order between the thoughts themselves, not thoughts of something. We're not saying it's not a correspondence yet. In the realm of pure thought, these categories are thinking themselves in a necessary order. And he says you can check that order and see if it has something called coherence and consistency. The thoughts in our heads are actually kind of like a plant. You have a root thought that then grows into more complicated thoughts. And then you take that structure in the realm of this super sensuous world, and you correspond that to objects in the sensuous world. So you have a coherence way to test it with system, and then you have a correspondence way of checking that system with actual reality. And then it's a dialectic, it's a back and forth that fills itself out on both sides. So that's what you have to do with real, genuine science and genuine philosophy.
Okay, all right. So I think something that I'm getting from that is that this is something that you can kind of figure out through self-reflection of your own mind and the way that it works, and that you will notice a pattern as you pay attention to your thought process that will reveal this idea that there is an ordered way that we think and that we work. And if we understand that process, then we can kind of remove ourselves from some of the other things that we tend to attach ourselves to. Am I getting close in some way?
Yeah, you can try and do it introspectively once you have the categories realized.
Okay.
The reason why we are in the world, I'll tell you, I'll give you a little bit of a backup information, because I know this is hard to understand. Like Hegel says, this is what's missing in the world, and it's hard for ordinary consciousness to grasp it. It took me 3,000 hours to kind of break out of what he calls pictorial thinking, ordinary philosophy, ordinary thought. And it's this concreteness. It all just kind of fits together, right? So I'll kind of explain one critical piece of the logic to explain why introspection is not quite enough. You actually have to have the external world. That's why Aristotle, his empiricism, is necessary. When people stereotype Hegel as just an absolute idealist, they mean subjective idealism, like the idealism of Kant. But Hegel's not just a subjective idealist. He actually sublates it. So subjective idealism is finite because it's in opposition to realism, right? So these two are opposites. But Hegel says, I'm both of them. He says, I'm not in this conditionality of idealism. Real idealism idealizes those two moments in an absolute idealism, where you're a perfect idealist and a perfect realist. So you have to have the world, and you have to have this inner world reflecting on itself. But you can't open up that world explicitly until you start having experiences. So the logic, this kind of super sensuous world, is not yet spirit. Spirit comes at the end, right? This is kind of like pure logic, thinking itself objectively, not from outside of itself, but immediately from within itself, where its thinking is its being. Ontology and epistemology are happening at the same time, what he calls speculatively. And he says it's perfect. It doesn't make any mistakes. There's no sensuousness. There's no tearing with like light or sound or anything. It's just the pure categories moving in themselves in their perfect movement without any tainting from human beings at all. So this is where the system develops. But in order for it to know itself, external knowledge, to know its own perfection, it turns itself into the absolute idea, this perfect reason, that then in its own freedom negates itself into what it's not, which is perfect irrationality, chaos, no system, no nothing. That's the being of nature that provides the contingency for us to be separate from it, to be external from it, so that we can return to it and have real knowledge about how perfect it is as ourselves. So spirit is the very high levels of looking back on that perfect logic and realizing externally as that same idea. We are the idea coming to higher levels of rationality and reflection. When you grasp that perfect idea in the world of logic and you get that dialectic going, when you realize that kind of perfectly, you turn into what Hegel calls absolute spirit. That's the true knowledge of things, the true wisdom of things. Okay, so is introspection enough? Well, you have two sides to you as spirit. You have this kind of nature side, which is pure contingency, irrationality. It's where our freedom comes from as caprice. You can do whatever you want. You don't have to think rationally. You can break from reason, right? This is where bad things can happen. Human beings are free that way. And Hegel says it's real freedom. This perfect logic actually does free itself into what it's not. So there's that side of you. And this side kind of confuses your categories, and animals don't really break out of this completely, but we do. We go one step further and purify thought into our other side, which is this pure rationality that we're returning to. So as you're purifying this, you're starting to grasp the orders, but you need to have that externality of experience to kind of teach you that you are the categories. So rationality is not just something you think, it's something that you actually are. Our bodies aren't just chaos. We are actually rational structures. We have arms and stuff. Evolution seems to be happening. But Hegel says it's not just in a Darwinian way. He does actually acknowledge it in his philosophy as monstrous experiments of nature. So Hegel does talk about a sort of Darwinian evolution, but he says that's not the whole story. There's this underlying divinity, this pure logic thinking itself that's being purified through that irrational chaos, that absurdity. And so you are coming through this, and that's why there's a tension in us. That's why our introspection is trying to get back to the reasoning, that perfect reasoning, but this freedom is what causes it to be a process. It allows it to happen in an external way that is knowledge. And so we're just in this process where if you didn't have that externality, you couldn't have any introspection because you're in it. You're completely immersed in it, like the perfect idea. So I'm just trying to say that introspection is key once you have empiricism. Then you move back and forth and you can check the categories.
Okay, so I understood that. I can't say that I understood a lot of the other stuff, but I did. I think I got the answer that I needed, so that's good. I am wondering, I'm deviating just a little bit from my plan here, but you talked about categories and orders, and you also talked about these three parts. My guess is that these are separate, but I guess really what I'm interested in, if they're not separate, you can tell me, but if they are separate, I want to know how many there are. Like, how many categories are there? Maybe we'll start there.
So I haven't counted them all. I counted the philosophers in his history of philosophy, and each philosopher has at least one universal, at least one. So that means there's 115 that have processed themselves in history. But I think somebody did count, and I heard there's about 257 categories in his entire, either in his Science of Logic or in the entire encyclopedia. But he said that it's only at the beginning. So his encyclopedia, his whole system is only an outline. And he says, we're going to come in and start sublating him. We're going to transcend and fill in this structure once we get out of ordinary thinking and get into genuine philosophy. So the short answer is, the way he's outlined it, like to get us started, I think we have 250 to work with or something like that.
Okay. Is this the same thing as orders, or is this different?
What do you mean by orders?
You had brought up orders.
Mm-hmm.
I think you were talking about like ordered thinking. Is that just like getting the categories in order? Is that the idea?
Yeah, so you start with the first category, those 250, let's say, and then the order starts from that first category, kind of like the roots of a plant. Like, you know how there's the roots and the roots kind of grow the rest of the structure? That's how your thoughts are. But it moves by dialectics, so that you have the seed, the roots, or the seed thought, which is pure being. That's the first universal, the first of those 250. Then it turns into pure nothing. So that's the second one. And then that turns into pure becoming. So those are the first three.
Those are the
And then
first
that
three.
turns
Okay.
into determinism. But the order is, yes, they're ordered in themselves, but they're also in this big ordered loop. So all 250 are in this one order, this universal order that Hegel says is what the logic is, and the applied logic as well.
So the first category is basically just root thought, or does it have a different name than that?
It's the most fundamental thought, which
Okay.
is pure being, like just the pure general being that gives rise to things at all. And it's also simultaneously pure knowing. So pure being and pure knowing in that first thought are actually happening at the same time as one and the same thing. That is also different. One is pure thought, one is immediate being. But they're so indeterminate at first. They're so abstract because they're technically less than nothing. They're an affirmative that you can't know anything about, but you know something is ising itself. It's like pure ising. It's just being in general that gives rise to all other forms of being, all other forms of universals. So yes, the first one is super abstract, but it begins as pure being and pure knowing.
Okay. All right. And then so originally when we had this conversation, I think I understand this now. You said that this can happen in 22 days. I'm sorry, it was 26 days originally. So is it now 22? Is that the just
Yeah.
make sure? Okay. All right, just making sure. Okay. Yeah, and then the last thing, I think this might be the most difficult, but I will do my best. This idea of God and coherence. Could you explain or define those for me?
Yeah. So the truth, Hegel says, is the whole. It's the totality. Because if there's something outside of the totality, it's not the real totality, right? So the new totality will have to grow to incorporate that thing that was missing. Now you got the real totality, everything, right? But then if there's something outside of it, then it just grows to incorporate that again. So the real totality has to have everything in it, and it all has to be linked together in sort of one logic. And so this is where this notion of coherence comes from, but it's also where this notion of God comes from. But Hegel says that this concept of God is really art kind of turning itself into religion. And then it kind of turns into philosophy. So there's a progression where these two worlds, the super sensuous world of logic, of pure thought, and our world of nature, our sensuous world, are purifying. The pure thoughts are purifying themselves and separating themselves more and more and more in gradual stages from this chaotic kind of sensuousness. It doesn't mean it's always chaotic. Art is kind of finding the harmony of the pure thoughts in the sensuousness. And when you see the divine idea or this absolute perfect reason in the world, when you recognize it for yourself, we see it as beauty before we become philosophers and can think it for ourselves. So in the beginning, it's just intuitive, it's implicit, it's in the world immanently, but it's not in our thinking. But we know it's there, and that's what art is. And that's why artists can't really think the universals. They have to kind of like open up a medium, like they have to channel it, they have to set their minds aside and then just let it come onto the canvas, come out in the art. They're not really thinking it, it's thinking itself through them. They're a channel. That's how you explain that incredible profoundness of artists. But then the second thing that happens is pure thought develops itself to another stage, a new level of purity called religion. And religion is a little bit more of a separation between sensuousness and these pure thoughts, these pure universals, these 250 categories. What they're trying to do is they're trying to capture that immense experience that the artist is trying to put on canvas, the concrete totality, the absolute. They're trying to capture that not necessarily in a sensuous way. They're trying to put it down in a systematic way in writing. This is what our divine texts are. This is what the Bible is. This is the Quran is. This is what all these amazing thinkers were doing. They started thinking what the artist was doing, but putting it down in its concrete whole that they were calling God. But then Hegel says the sensuousness gets in the way, and it turns God not into this totality, this scientific totality. It turns it into what our limits are. And you get these personifications and these artistic forms that become oppressive because particularity is finite and they war with each other. It's not yet perfect super sensuousness. It's not the pure thoughts thinking themselves. So you get all this bias coming in that kind of ruins the science of it. But there's a lot of speculative thought in it, which is why it looks contradictory. But Hegel says that's the truth of how logic actually is. It is circular, but you have to see it in its right order. That's what the science of logic is. That's where the coherence starts to come in. That's where religion separates itself more from sensuousness and actually separates itself or sublates religious consciousness entirely into a higher mode, which is what Hegel calls real philosophy. Real philosophy is the realm of pure thought thinking itself purely. No more sensuousness. That's where the philosopher knows the world of pure thought and sees the pure universals and starts thinking about them in their pure system without any other distractions. There's no color. They're in this calm world of supersensuousness, thinking supersensuously. They're in this supersensuous world thinking supersensuously. And this is where they start to write down the coherence purely in these principles or these kind of axioms that only need themselves to logically make sense. But at first, we're only doing it in broken fragments. Like, and mathematics is a good example of this. We can like explain the triangle. We can explain the square. We can kind of explain those in equations, right? You can't see the equations in the sensuous world. They're in our minds. And Hegel says this is the very beginning part of philosophy, but it's not genuine philosophy yet. To get the coherence, you have to see the whole as a system. So he says we have to preserve something in religion. That's what a sublation is. You cancel the limit, but you preserve the truth. So what we're preserving in religion is this concrete totality, God, the science of sciences, but we're canceling the limit, which is the sensuousness. So we need to take that concreteness and bring it back to its form as pure thought and get the universals in this systematic totality. And you start to get this resonancy, this coherence that starts to tell you if the categories are in their right order, because you have a kind of method that keeps repeating itself. And if you have a section of the system that doesn't repeat in that way, you can kind of suspect that it's not really logical. There's something there that's not fitting. And being able to identify what's not fitting is where coherence becomes this falsifiability criterion, where you can say, well, the categories themselves aren't fitting like all the other categories. So either our criterion changed, or we're not thinking purely enough about these universals in their true dialectical movement. We must be introducing something or missing something. So I hope I'm answering your question. That's how coherence is supposed to work. That's why it's supposed to be a system that circles back on itself, because it's supposed to be self-reflexive.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I think I'm getting this idea of like God being like the whole of the truth. Am I on track there?
The science of sciences in atheistic terms, but it's the same thing. We're idealizing it.
Okay.
You can be religious, you can be philosophical. It's the same circle of reason, the same system.
Okay. Yeah, somebody has a question too, and I'll incorporate that in a second. But I guess one question that I always have when God comes up is God conscious? Is this idea of God a conscious entity? Because that seems to separate some beliefs of God. You would say it is?
I would say something really interesting happens with Hegel, and I think he's right. He says that this world of pure thought, of the categories, they at first start without anything at all. Like there's not even a God, there's nothing. You actually are supposed to negate everything you think you know, kind of like Descartes did. Descartes said, well, what can I really know that's not tainted by my finiteness and my sin and all this stuff? What is real philosophy based on? Real wisdom. So he says, well, I can't trust my senses. So he grasped that sensuousness was kind of this chaotic thing that couldn't be trusted. So he says, well, let's cancel all that. And you get at the I. And he says, well, if a demon tries to trick me that I'm not thinking, this pure thinking, right, then I have to be thinking to know that I'm not thinking. So he says that contradiction is why I can know that I think, therefore I am. So the cogito ergo sum comes out, and that's what Hegel calls the first moment of genuine philosophy, realizing itself as pure thought in pure thought. So we're grasping ourselves as pure thinking things with no sensuousness. But he says that's not skeptical enough. You actually need to cancel that too and get even more fundamental. And he says the real beginning of philosophy doesn't start with cogito ergo sum, because this, why do you need the self to do the thinking? That's an assumption that's not justified. We just treat it like it's justified because it's obvious to us. But obviousness doesn't mean it's scientific. So when you cancel the self, you end up at pure nothingness and presuppositionlessness, where real science is supposed to start. And he says when you cancel that absolute canceling of everything, it leads to another contradiction, which is that when you cancel canceling, it can't go back into nothingness. It's already canceled all that. So it has to go into the affirmative, but it's an affirmative that can't be anything more than the nothing. So that's why Hegel says the only thing that's less than this nothingness is sheer, immediate indeterminacy. It's so little, you can't even tell what it is. You can't even tell what it is ising. And he says that this is how you're supposed to start the system of real philosophy. And there's no God here. There's no nothing. There's not even you. You canceled your thinking self. Cogito ergo sum is canceled. This is now literally just pure canceling itself into something. So anyway, this kind of goes on, and it eventually starts turning itself into cause and effect, turns itself into Spinoza's substance, turns itself into the notion. And the notion is where we get a universal for a universal. For ordinary consciousness, this isn't going to make much sense, but I'm just trying to pave a new way of thinking about philosophy that we are greatly underappreciating. I just want to point people in the direction saying this is worth looking at. It's painful, but I think this is what the world needs to create a new world spirit. So I hope you're picking up a kind of coherence, a cadence to my speech, that there's something that seems to be building here. But subjectivity is just a pure universal for a pure universal. And they kind of rotate and they integrate and they separate over and over and over again. We are just a version of this in sensuous reality. But long story short, this is what Hegel says personality is. So in some sense, the divine idea, the absolute idea, is like a monotheistic God that has personality. But it's like a cognition, like a perfect reason that is cognizing itself perfectly, but not as external to itself. It's perfect only in itself. In order to know itself as that perfection, to have real personality, it has to come through us. That's why we're in the image of God in religious consciousness. We're just repeating that logic, and we're upgrading our reasoning to this higher personality, which is just the true philosopher, the absolute spirit, the pure reasoning, thinking itself as a totality.
Okay, all right. I am able to connect a lot of what you're saying to things that I've learned. There is still a lot of gaps here for me, but I mean, ultimately, a lot of what you're saying I've encountered in some of the Eastern religions that I've studied, or like some of the like Kenneth Burke, for instance, talks about a difference between the semantic and the poetic, and so I'm able to grasp some of this. But I think, yeah, what we really do need, we can come back to some of the questions that I had, but maybe a concrete example. I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to try it out anyway. So I think, yeah, it might be helpful if maybe we could find something else that we disagree on, and see if you can talk me through utilizing this method um, to kind of get a different result than maybe we would have without my recognition of this process. Is that possible at all?
Sure.
Okay.
So a concrete example. Do you have one in mind?
No, I mean, I don't in particular, like, because I also don't know a lot of the other things that you believe or whatever. I could kind of, it sounds like probably we're going to end up agreeing on a lot. Like evolution wouldn't be something that we could probably disagree on. Um, I don't know if you're into any conspiracy theories, like the moon landing being faked or anything like that. So
Okay, well, I got two already. So evolution, and let's just say religion and philosophy itself, because
okay,
religion and philosophy are in opposition in the world today. Religious people fight with philosophers and scientists. Atheists fight with theists. They can't agree, and because a lot of our nation states are still religious, especially in developing countries, there's a lot of lack of cooperation in the world to address climate change or any real big problem that's potentially threatening our species. Like they're saying, we're going through a sixth mass extinction right now. Like all the bees are dying, like everything's dying, and we reached this point of no return already. Like we reached 400 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere, which means 1.5 degrees Celsius is going to increase around the world as an average temperature, no matter what we do now. Even if you stop all cars, everything, we're going to get that 1.5 degrees, which could hit a tipping point. These people are saying the problem with humanity is not these problems, it's the fact we can't cooperate. And it's because these oppositions can't be sublated. So this is a really easy one. So, well, how do we sublate? How do we get religion and philosophy or atheism, theism to work together?
Okay.
And how do you get even religions to work together? Because even once you have a God concept, it's so different that they can't even work amongst themselves. And if we don't solve this dialectic, if we don't solve this opposition, then that's 85% of the world's population that can't work together, because 85% of people, according to the last global census, said that they identify as spiritual in some way. So it seems a really pertinent dialectic to sublate out of this negative moment of reason. So the process, once you see it in its universality, when you see it happening over and over and over again, it starts to do something to you. You start to experience that coherence, this systematic sense making that is the same thing repeating itself consistently. You start to believe in it. You start to say, wow, the world actually seems to be this way. Okay, this seems to be the truth. That seems to have some more truth in this fragmented way where we're treating biology as different from physics, and we're teaching sociology as different from psychology, and all these things seem to be different logics working themselves out. But Hegel says, no, they're all the same logic. They're just broken and disconnected because we're not wise enough to see the logic turning into its different moments. He says the same thing's happening with religion and between religions and philosophy and science, between them. So he says, once you start grasping the universality, you start to have faith that every opposition can be sublated. And he says,
Okay.
apply this. So it makes you think, okay, well, it's worth applying this model. We have two opposites that don't recognize each other. What does that mean? It means that it's in abstract negation. But we know that if everything is really just negation of negation and negation, 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 we know that there must be a sublation. So we should start looking for that. What does that look like? Well, Hegel says there's another way to describe sublation. And remember, I said sublation is the universal logical piece missing in all 200 and some countries, in 7,000 languages, except for maybe German. It's preventing us from embracing our pure thought nature in a way that's more harmonious, that overcomes the slaughter bench of history. So he describes it like this. Yes, it's a negation of negation. That's the negative way of defining it. But to say more about it, he says there's a positive way of describing it. And it's that there's three moments to every logical move in the universe. Everything that is rational is actual, and everything that is actual is rational in these three movements. So that means everything in science, from ontology, epistemology, to space, time, physics, chemistry, biology, animals, animalism, consciousness, psychology, anthropology, phenomenology, legal status, morality, the family, civil life and market economies, state life and constitutions, international affairs, art itself, religion itself, philosophy itself, the philosophy of philosophy. Literally everything, if it is rational, has three moments to it. Because logic has three sides. The first is that it's called the moment of abstract understanding. It's where you try and hold a concept still as if there's nothing else that's opposing it. The second moment of logic is that it negates itself into its own opposite, and then you get that warring. What is the negative moment of reason, the dialectical movement that we see with Plato and Socrates, where they're just reversing, and they don't recognize themselves yet, so they stay opposed as self-subsistent entities. But then the third moment is that it sublates, and it achieves this last movement because it recognizes the commonality in both sides, and it recognizes through that commonality the absolute limit. So you grasp the limit that clarifies why they're different, but at the same time you see why they're the same. And that happening at the same time is the speculative moment that Hegel calls it, that brings you to a higher universal that grasps them both as moments, necessary moments. Remember, they're trying to cancel each other. So they're trying to say, you're garbage, you don't need to be here, I'm going to 100% cancel you. So the atheists are saying, religion is garbage. Like, there's nothing worth preserving in religion. Like, anything that was good was accidental. We just need to get rid of the whole thing. That's an absolute abstract negation. But the same thing is happening from the other side. So religious people and theists are looking at atheists as heathens and saying, no, we can't follow them. They need to be canceled 100%. They're actually evil. So we need to get rid of, both sides are trying to cancel each other 100%. And they're not trying to see the kernel of truth, the universal, on both sides.
Okay.
Because we're genuine philosophers and we have the faith that this can happen, we start looking for the ideal.
Right.
Just
right.
looking for it starts to break you out of that abstract opposition and anger. And when you start looking for it, Hegel says the dialectic starts working its magic, and eventually you will find the ideal, because the rational is actual and the actual is rational. When you find that kernel, it does two things. One is it clarifies that limit, but it causes you to love that other thing. That enemy is actually just yourself in a different way, and you start living it as yourself, as an integration. And that's what kind of overcomes in debates. Like, one of the biggest problems with debates, where I'm talking at length,
No, you're
is
right.
that we run out of time, right? Like, there's actually three brains in the human brain. There's a really old autonomic brain, the cerebellum and the stem and all your like heart functions, super subconscious. Then there's the animal brain, the limbic brain, which is like responsible for your emotions and your instinctual reactions, fight or flight kind of stuff. And then we have our newest brain, the prefrontal cortex, the neocortex, which is where rational thought happens. And so in a debate, there's actually a time, if there's a real negation there and you start to separate, there's a timer that starts up, and it starts to go exponential. And what happens is your emotions start to get involved, and your limbic brain starts to peak up and says, hey, there's a abstract negation here. I'm going to start defending myself. So you start doing it with your prefrontal cortex, and you say, I'm going to out-reason this guy. But when it's not working, when you can't find that ideal, you stay in that negation, the limbic brain starts to get more and more blood to it, because it's like, I'm in danger. And the longer it stays there, it starts to ramp up until it reaches that exponential curve part and just takes off. And there's actually a part in the brain called, like, there's a crisis point where the brain literally turns off the prefrontal cortex to a certain degree and rechannels blood to the limbic brain to go to the muscles to start fighting. Like, you are not capable of rational thought in the normal sense after the crisis point. You have to like calm down, you have to self-soothe, and then you can return to reason. So really, time is a critical problem in terms of modern argumentation, in terms of trying to find this sublation. So the more efficacious we can become in the process, the better our chances are of finding the ideal in both sides and believing it's really there, even if we don't want to believe it. What that looks like with philosophy and religion, I already explained. What is the ideal that we're preserving on both sides, and what are we canceling?
Okay. Yeah, because that's actually exactly where I want to go. I think it'll help, particularly my audience, if we have the conversation. So, like, for instance, I can take up the position here of being an atheist, and how does this conversation look when I am talking to someone who is a theist? Now, on the one hand, I can understand theism, and I can even understand like poetic interpretations of God, but it has to be poetic. I can't interpret it literally at all. So now, how can I start to view that disconnect between me thinking that of the gods that I know, when I think about God in any, like, what I would call conscious sense, a conscious God, um, I either see too many things in the objective world that contradict that God, which leads me to atheism, or I don't see any evidence of that God, which also leads me to atheism. So now, if I am talking to somebody who believes the opposite, they think that there are clear objective things in the universe that can lead you to theism, and that there is no evidence in the universe that there is no God. So they're also negating the atheist position. How can I view that differently? I don't view them as an enemy. So there's some things here you're saying about them being like enemies or me wanting to destroy theism. I'm not saying that you're saying that I'm saying that, but that is kind of the idea, like the combating between ideas, right? Is that one kind of wants to destroy the other, but what is this change in terms of, okay, now I'm talking to a theist, but I understand these, this order or these categories. How do I get to that point where I reconcile those two things? Is there any way that you could think of? Or
Yeah, this is brilliant. I think we might actually achieve the claim that I made at the beginning, that we can change the world in 22 days. If we can sublate this dialectic on air right now with you as a real atheist, and
okay,
me, I'm a genuine philosopher, right? So I'm actually on both sides already. But I have to do a
okay,
good job trying to represent the theist, or else the theist watching won't believe that we actually sublated it. So we
okay,
actually have to come from the real truth. If you don't, we just implicitly know that's not right. So I will try and do my best here, but this could be the unlocking key. That's the perfect question. That's why you guys are like the street epistemologists, because you know your stuff. You're getting into the meat. So sometimes a well-formed question is half the answer. So I picked up three things just now. So one is, if you're already finding something ideal in religion or theism, which is your opposite, that's because you're a philosopher. You're already starting to get into what Hegel calls genuine philosophy, but because you haven't grasped sublation yet, you're not what he would call a genuine philosopher. You're an abstract philosopher. So you're still doing philosophy. You're kind of, you know that there's something more to this. So you're striving. You have some kind of faith that the world is wise in some way, but you might not understand the supersensuous reason and its universality yet. So that's why I think it's working for you. That's why I think you're a great person to talk to, and you're a great representative of philosophy right now. But let's try and bring it to genuine philosophy. So you said two things make you not want to believe in God. So one is that there's just things in the world that contradict the nature of God as God is defined in religion. And then the other thing is that there's no evidence for you to believe in a God at all in the real world. You just don't see it. I guess we could ask, can you unpack those? And then maybe if you unpack them, I can jump to the other side and start finding the ideal in it, but also the limit. And then when we do both of those at once, it should clarify the theist position and then have you thinking kind of like a theist in a contradictory way at the end.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. I will say that I have the ability to think like a theist, so I already have some of that. But in the most literal sense, if somebody defines God as the person who flooded the earth, flooded the whole earth within the last 6,000 years, looking at the evidence on Earth and knowing that the information isn't indicating a world flood, I can dismiss that as a God that exists. I can say there is evidence that that type of God, the one that flooded the world in 6 days, or I'm sorry, that flooded the world, the whole world, cannot exist based off the information. And this can be done with multiple types of religions where the historical data that we have or data we have about the earth contradicts what that God was supposed to do. And so that's that side of it. The other one is I can't prove that there is no conscious entity that is all powerful, that is kind of all knowing, maybe even all good, or has some attributes there that I would reasonably call a God. I can't prove that that God doesn't exist. The only thing that I can say is I don't have any information that convinces me that that God exists. I don't have any good arguments that I've heard that that God exists. And so I also set that one aside, not because I have definitive evidence that it doesn't, but just because I don't have evidence for it. So those are my best attempts at elaborating.
Okay, so the flood. So you're talking about Noah's floods. You're talking about the Christian God mostly.
No, actually, I could do this with multiple gods. I mean, I could do this with the idea of the floating rock in that supposedly Muhammad levitated a rock that is still supposed to be in Israel, I believe, and having seen that shot at different angles and knowing that it doesn't actually defy any laws of gravity, again, leads me to believe that a god that defied the law of gravity by lifting that rock didn't actually exist because the rock isn't defying gravity. That would be another example.
Okay, so these are your examples for the no evidence in the world, right? There's no evidence in the world to suggest there was a flood. There's no flying rocks around.
No, that there's contradictory evidence. So not just that there's no evidence, but that there's contradictory evidence.
Suggesting the opposite, because I was just going to ask you. So your first part was there's contradictions in the Bible, and that there's no evidence in the real world, right? So what about? Do you have an example of a contradiction just in the Bible that's not maybe something physical or a claim about the physical world, like just in itself?
Yeah.
Which one would you go to?
I'd probably go to just, I guess this is off the top of my mind, but the two different fathers given for oh, why can't I remember his name now? Mary's husband. What is Mary's husband name? Somebody help me out here. Do you know who I'm talking about?
About
Jesus' stepfather. Jesus' stepfather. If you look in the Bible, there are two different fathers that are given in the text. Joseph, thank you. Thank you, Dolly. Yeah, there are two different fathers given by two different genealogies. That would just be off the top of my head, though. I'm sure I could think of better ones, but
okay, so that's a historical one.
yeah.
Okay, so we haven't hit a logical. There's two logical ones I was expecting you to kind of say off the bat, but I can kind of lump that
Problem of
one
evil,
maybe
maybe.
back into history. But you're right. In terms of like it being in the Bible, you can't have two dads, right? It doesn't make sense when you say that there was. But normally people would say, let's say the Christian example. Well, how can Jesus be 100% man and 100% God? How can he be finite and infinite at the same time? That's usually a logical contradiction.
Okay.
Or even the alpha and the omega. How can the beginning be the end and the end the beginning? How do you resolve that paradox?
Yeah,
I think that.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna, bringing up like the problem of evil. I think if you're looking for more logical contradictions, the problem of evil, I think, is pretty good. And also this idea, one that I've thought of recently, has been this idea that um, the Bible says that God wants everybody to be saved and know the truth. But we don't. We obviously don't. We're obviously not all saved according to the Bible and know the truth. So then the response to that is, well, God had to allow for free will, but the Bible also says that God is the God of the impossible. So the question is, could God have both given us free will and ensured that everybody was saved to know the truth? The answer has to be yes, because he's the God of the impossible. So then there is a contradiction here. This is a huge logical contradiction.
Okay, I'm going to try and tackle this. So now we got a kind of set of claims here that we can kind of get through, and I'll try and explain how Hegel answers these, I think, in this universal logical way that hasn't happened in history. So we've had this split with Hegel between the right Hegelians and these left Hegelians. And the right Hegelians, like as soon as Hegel died, they did exactly what he told them not to do. He says, stop doing this abstract negation and splitting things apart and realizing they're all moments. So he died, and then all of a sudden they split into two different factions between the religious and the conservatives, who said Hegel was a religious person. He was a Christian. He even declared it himself, and all this science and atheism. Oh, that's all you guys. And then there's the other side, which is the young Hegelians or the left Hegelians, who are like, Hegel was an atheist, a covert atheist, and all this Christian stuff was just to appease you guys because you were going to chop his head off in like a French Inquisition or something, or make him lose his job. So this has kind of been more or less what's still happening today. That we have our left Hegelians and our right Hegelians. They might dress it up in different ways, but fundamentally we kind of have the same divide. Zizek might be a different. He's kind of sublating, actually. You can see him moving back in contradictory phrases. That's because he's tearing, he's struggling with this contradictory nature of the circularity of pure thought. He knows that you can't just choose one side or the other randomly. There's a reasoning to it. And I think that we're going to apply that in this particular example.
Okay.
And it should be new. Okay, so in terms of, let's pick up the second things, the lack of evidence in the world. This one's kind of easy for Hegel.
Okay.
How do you get a theist and an atheist? How do you get an atheist to start thinking like an atheist like a theist? Well, you said that there's no evidence in the world for the flood, and there's no floating rock, and maybe there were supposed to be two historical fathers. These are all, if you look at them, they're all sensuous. So if they're in the world, they're sensuous. And Hegel says when you read the Bible, especially the Christian Bible, he says it's not like there's not the word of God in there. He says the problem is the presentation. So it's the poetic stuff that you were mentioning before. So Hegel agrees, even as a Christian, a declared Christian, he says even his own divine text that he follows, the Bible, he's saying there's something we have to cancel in the Bible. And it's probably the same thing that Jesus himself was trying to cancel, which was the sensuousness. So there's a huge irony here, where if you look at how, at least with Christianity, we'll just keep it simple for time's sake, but this does apply to all religions. All of them are sensuous in some way, trying to deal with pure thought, from Buddhism, Hinduism. Hegel gives a lot of examples, but he says Christianity was supposed to be this like more sophisticated version, and it still couldn't break free. So as much as he loves Christianity, he's sort of enmeshed in the dogma, he's really not. And this is where the left Hegelians are a little bit right. But in terms of the Bible, he calls it a nose of wax. So he says it does have pure thought in it. It has pure thought is God's thought, right? The science of logic is pure thoughts thinking themselves as God, God's mind thinking itself. But when we try and put that into a Bible, into written form, we attach our sensuousness to it. It has to be physically written down in time. It has a certain language. All these types of things get attached that aren't necessarily essential to pure thought. We're just trying to communicate it externally. And he says that you can interpret all these different thoughts in different ways because the Bible was written in not its scientific form. It was written in sensuous form through parable. And even Jesus, if you look back at how he talks about the Old Testament, he said he's the fulfillment of it, but there was something limited about the Old Testament that he wanted to get away from. And what he was trying to cancel in the Old Testament was that it was mechanical. The spirit was dead in some way, and people were thinking their ways around the laws. The laws were there, but they weren't doing what they were supposed to do, creating this better kind of society the way he thought it should happen. So what he said was, I'm not trying to throw the whole Old Testament out. Basically what he's saying is not doing an abstract negation. He's not throwing the baby out the bathwater. He's actually trying to do a sublation. He's saying, I'm going to cancel something in the Old Testament, but there's still fundamental truth there. There's something he's preserving. He's turning the Old Testament into a moment of the truth. So what he's canceling is this mechanical, dead, sensuous way of following the law. He's saying, I'm going to bring it to life, which is reason. Real, genuine reason is fluid. It's not stuck in dogma. And the law is dogma. It's here it is, just do it. And he says, that's not real reason. You got to think it for yourself. And he says, you have to not do it in this sinful way, which is in the flesh. It's not, you can't be fixed, your reasoning can't be fixated in sensuousness because it distracts you. And he came to do that. He tried sublating the Old Testament, and he started creating a New Testament. But he didn't want to recreate that old spirit, that old religious spirit. So Hegel was basically saying Jesus was a philosopher. But what ended up happening is he couldn't sublate all of religious consciousness, the sensuousness that surrounded the pure thoughts. Because back then, 2,000 years ago, almost nobody knew how to read or write. So you couldn't get this higher level of pure thought coming through. He says writing is actually a higher form of communication than speaking, even though it says speaking is profound in itself. That's why rhetoric, and as it develops philosophically, dialectic becomes the higher form. But when you start writing it, it starts to purify itself in alphabets and stuff like that beyond hieroglyphs. He says once you start doing this, you start breaking out of sensuousness, but you can also fall into edification because the words are fixed themselves. So they start approximating the law again. And that's exactly what happened to Jesus' message as a philosopher. He kind of came into maybe bringing real philosophy, genuine philosophy, but he warned his disciples. He was saying, look, I'm telling this to you in sensuous form. I'm using sensuousness to kind of communicate this thing you can't see, touch, or taste. It's super sensuous, right? He said, you won't get it. You got to watch me doing it. You got to watch me talking and picking up the pattern. Picking up the pattern that's repeating this, the universal logic that he was calling the Father is the science of logic. So he was trying to do this with people that were not yet able to understand. So he said, I'm going to tell it to you in parable. And what happened? The disciples started recognizing it, but they didn't know how to purify it past the sensuous. They didn't know how to put it into scientific form. So when Jesus died, they didn't write it down. Like, it's kind of funny. Jesus didn't try and write it down. Why did he resist writing it down? Why didn't he just like put it down? It's the same reason why Hegel wrote the way he did, is to prevent our ordinary thinking from edifying and killing the life of the words. So if you try and read Hegel and try and edify it in this dead mechanical way, in these abstractions, these boxes, he writes in such a way that he doesn't let you do that, which is why Hegel is so painful to read for ordinary consciousness. That's why it took me 3,000 hours to break out of it. He won't let you do that. So Jesus was trying to do the same thing, I think. But what happened is after 50 years, people were like, hey, we're losing the oral tradition or whatever. And they said, let's start writing it down. And so Paul and these other guys, I guess, started writing it down. And it started turning back into, guess what? Religious consciousness. They wrote it down, and now we have a New Testament that you got to follow dogmatically, just like the Old Testament. So it killed the spirit, which is why the church might be struggling right now. All these pastors and priests are talking to me, freaking out, being like, something is wrong. You know, like science and the atheists and all this CRISPR technology and all this crazy anti-God stuff is like taking over the world. And we're about to lose our tax-exempted status for the churches. Now we're going to have to pay taxes. All the secular world is winning, basically. And the Pope is doing really interesting things that are usually contradictory in the Catholic religion. Like, all this stuff is going on. But the sensuousness is the problem. And I think Jesus would agree with you that these parables, these miracles, all the flood, all these things are really just stories to tell evolution, to tell the scientific pure thought version of it to people that couldn't grasp it at the time. So Hegel says that not only is the flood like that, but the Garden of Eden is like that too. That's another usual sensuous example. Well, if there's a real garden that's perfect, where is it on Earth? Like where in space and time? And Hegel says the logic isn't spacelessness and timelessness. It is just a world of pure thought. And he says they're misinterpreting that story too. What it's supposed to mean is actually you start sinfully, but that just means finitude. You become finite from infinite pure knowledge. And then what happens is most Christians or people who are religious will throw the baby out with the bathwater. They'll abstractly negate knowledge and say, human knowledge is sinful. Don't do it. Stay in faith. Don't think. And you get all this oppression. You get all these like priests preying on people and not letting them think for themselves. And you really get dogma and abuse. And Hegel said that wasn't the point of the stories. It's been twisted, and it might have got twisted during scholasticism when Rome was using it as a state religion to control people. So it lost the spirit, and it really became the law. Then it really was just a repeat of the Old Testament, and the spirit of Jesus's super sensuous philosophical message was like completely lost. The way was like almost completely lost. But it grew enough to protect slaves, and it started freeing people, and it did introduce new reason. Sorry, this is a long way to address your first point, but it's the sensuousness that's the problem. We need to return it back to the super sensuous logic of what the Garden of Eden was supposed to mean, which is that you don't throw out knowledge, you actually reach an inflection point where the finiteness starts to approximate real, genuinely total scientific knowledge as spirit. Spirit is grasping those universals in its scientific dialectical order. And that's what reunites you back with the supersensuous realm, which is the Garden of Eden. But now you're doing it not just in faith, you're doing it thinkingly. They're trying to approximate genuine philosophy as a proto-science, but they're not able to shed these sensuous parables because they're afraid. It's the only thing protecting them, so they're using authority to protect the oppression that's going on. Until you address that problem, they're never going to let it go. So as genuine philosophers, we have to show the divine essence of God in the parables, by showing the science of logic in it, not by an abstract negation, but by going into the Bible as being more a theist than a theist and pulling out this science of logic, this perfect science of sciences that is self-justifying with no revelation. That's what God is. And you can do the sublation by saying, look, you're preserving something in the Bible, and that is the thing that all theists want. The principle, the real universal that you're giving them is the thing they want. They don't really care about the stories. If you preserve God in any form and you prove it, that's what everybody wants. They want a certainty that God is protecting them. If you do that and show the science of logic is inside of the Bible, you're giving them, you're preserving. So remember, the first moment of sublation is you got to preserve something. We're preserving the thing they cherish most, which is God. Okay, but you're canceling something now and raising it to genuine philosophy. What are we canceling? We're canceling the sensuousness, and we're raising it to pure thought. So what you get is this contradictory sounding statement that the real God is the atheist God. Atheists prove through science and logic that God exists through pure logic. And the sensuousness is no longer the essential thing. That's the sinful thing that Jesus, in Christianity anyway, was trying to cancel. But ironically, because people were sinful once he died, the dialectic twisted them into the opposite and made them sensuous. They made the super sensuous sensuous because he couldn't correct them in real time in a living way like street epistemology is trying to do in a real-time conversation. So I think that Hegel has the right answer here. That's how you should think about the Bible, and it provides an extreme version of empathy. Why people latch on to this totality is because they want security and they're traumatized in some way. And we need to go into the religion and say, hey, it's safe to let go of the parables because there's something 10 times more profound that's still God. It's the super sensuous essence of Jesus. Jesus was the truth, the way, and the life. Well, what is the truth, the way, and the life? It's the science of logic. And when you grasp this, you align yourself with the wisdom of the world, and you can protect yourself as spirit on earth. And Jesus said, when you do that, you will become greater, you will do greater things than I. That means if he was God on earth, that means you become God on earth too. So it's a self-empowerment thing that the atheist really wants, because what the atheist is resisting in religious dogma is this external authority that they can't know. And atheists are like, no, I can know it because you're going to abuse me if I just follow your word. I want to know that God. And Hegel says, you can now. It's determinate. I'm giving it to you straight. And guess what? It's already in you in a scattered way. Learn the order. Not only do you know God as yourself, but you become wise and scientific and a genuine philosopher at the exact same time. So you get both worlds at the same time, which is the true sublation.
Okay.
So that's beginning to address your second point. We have to know what is essential. So we're talking about the essential thing now, which is what is the message behind those sensuous parables? Because you're right, there's no evidence for a lot of them in the world.
No, yeah, I mean,
That
I
doesn't mean the
can.
Bible is totally wrong.
Right. I mean, I can understand most of the Bible in a poetic way. I still think that part of the divide is in the literal sense. And that's where I'm still having trouble seeing the reconciliation. If somebody literally believes X is true and I believe the negation of that, I can understand them poetically and I can empathize with them and I can understand emotional motivations for why they believe this thing, and be empathetic. I can do all these things without the reconciliation, I feel like. But really quick, I think Dolly had a question and I wanted to come back to it because I forget what it was at this point. Dolly, I don't know if you want to put it up on the screen again or you want to pop in and give it, but I wanted to give you that opportunity.
There's still the second part of your question that I want to address. The sublation won't be complete for you until I address that contradictory nature of things.
Okay.
That's
All right.
what we're going to talk about. What if there's a God, what does the atheist God look like? That's where it should start clicking. So I still have that. I want to explain it, but let's get to Dolly first.
Maybe not. Maybe he's cool.
Okay. So I guess I can just jump into it because it's been about an hour and a half. So that addresses the thing that the atheist wants to do. They want to get rid of the parable and the weird stories and the miracles and all the stuff you can't know or explain. And the religious mind is attaching to it because they don't feel safe with an alternative. The atheist isn't giving a better God to believe in, so they're never going to come over to your side. So then, okay, well, if we have to have this God notion to sublate, what does the God look like now that we have the atheist version of it? That there's pure thoughts underneath these sensuous examples that are approximating this divine logic. What does it look like then? Determinately. Hegel says the problem of all religions, whether they're polytheistic, whether they're monotheistic, whether they're pantheistic, panentheistic, doesn't matter. That's why you're right to say as an atheist, you've negated them all. You canceled them all. You found a contradiction with every single one of them. But what Hegel says, the reason why they're contradictory is because they inherently are dialectical. They have to be. That's the truth. If they weren't contradictory, they probably wouldn't be a moment of the total system. So he says they're actually, the reason why you can find the contradiction in them is because the contradiction is what brings them to life and moves them as a moment in the system. So all these different versions of God, Hegel says, are just indeterminacies, things you can't know, some authority far and beyond. That's just a powerful thing. The Lord, you have to obey it. Saying they're all kind of indeterminate. That's what all their mistakes are. But he says they're just moments of indeterminacy on this thing that is determinate. And when you grasp it as a whole, a logical whole, that's what real God is. And so he says the Judaic God is just pure being. Remember that first seed category? He says that's just a notion, that's just the sensuous concept for that universal, pure being. Pure being in itself is indeterminate. So that is where its truth is at the beginning. But you're not supposed to stay there, Hegel says. That turns into the next determination or the next universal. So in Hinduism, that pure being God turns into pure nothing, pure becoming, determinate being, quality, something, other, all these other categories, right? But he says all those universals in the supersensuous realm are eternal. They all have to exist forever because it's pure thought thinking itself purely logically. So it always had to have been before it began. And he gives you a really incredible way to start that, which I can get into in maybe another talk, or even this one if we really get into it. But he says what all these religious gods were doing were just tracing out the science of logic at different stages. So one will focus just in the beginning and they won't move to the other determinations. But the other ones that move to the other determinations, like the polytheistic religions like Hinduism or Greek mythology, each one of their gods is just a sensuous version of one of the universals, whether it's cause or effect or being or nothing or whatever. They're all sort of trying to approximate these universals. But the mistake of polytheism is that they don't understand that it's related to that first indeterminate God. They're all forms of the same God. They usually treat the gods as individual self-subsisting things. He says that's the mistake or limit of the moment of polytheism. Once that indeterminate first God turns into all these different moments of God, the polytheist, it returns, once you do realize it's all one God, it returns to a sort of a monotheistic God. But when you get to the monotheistic God, that's the God of all the gods, at first you can only grasp it as faith, that it's such perfect thoughts you can't think it. So they don't realize that the polytheistic gods are the divine thoughts of that monotheistic God moving in their perfect rationality. So they're still disconnecting the gods. So that's why people are looking at God in these different pockets, is because they're not noticing the universal logic that is connecting them all as the same thing. And then the panentheistic God is where that perfect idea of logic others itself, negates its own self into what it's not, which is nature. So then you get nature as the God, you get empiricism, the God of naturalists, but it's also where God becomes transcendental. So then you get the transcendental monotheistic God. It's all the same logic. But even though that God is transcendental, it's still in the sensuousness. So it makes it immanent. Then you kind of get the Christian version of the God that's immanent and beyond. You can get spirit. All these different religions are really doing the same God, which is just one logic. That's how you're supposed to understand what this real atheistic version of God is supposed to look like. But you don't really, as an atheist, you're not going to really embrace this, even if it does make sense of what all these other religions were trying to do, until you grasp what logic itself is. Because the atheists, if they're scientific, they rely on science to say, well, what can I know if I can't rely on God? We, in ourselves, are rational structures. There's an impulse in us to want to know the truth, to protect ourselves, if anything. Just to survive, knowledge is power. If you know that the tiger is going to come at this time of day, you're just going to be climbing a tree or something. You're going to make decisions based on how the world actually works, even if you're not doing it philosophically. We're always doing that. So logic is the opposite of revelation. In a way, revelation is there is something here and there's a beyond that you can't know anything about. That's what God is to religion, right? It's so perfect you can't know. But logic can also suffer the same problem. So revelation is what logic isn't supposed to be. It's supposed to be, no, I justify everything I claim to be true. Everything that's immediate or is claimed to be a fact has some kind of justification proving that it is a fact, and it can be falsifiable. It's like Karl Popper and all the logical positivists. So he says that's the fundamental difference between revelation and logic. And that's why it looks like logic is against religion, because religion is revelationary. So he says there's an inner contradiction that's going to happen to you when you take these to their extremes, and any real atheist has to do this. Or else you're turning into your opposite, or else you're making atheism into a religion. And it's that if the true beginning of logic is not self-justifying, it's being revealed. And if it's being revealed, then that means there's something you're claiming to be true that's not justified. That's your God. And the God of atheism is usually axiomatic thinking in science. All the axioms in science that aren't justified but are taken as immediately self-evident, they're just so simple, they're just given as true. Those are the gods of atheists. So for example, in geometry, how do you prove the straight line? How do you prove the null set, the zero? These are so basic, there's nothing inside of them that you can use to mediate them. They're just immediately true. But Hegel says, no, when you're a real philosopher, when you grasp the true totality of the circle of reason, even those simple axioms are making assumptions that elude us because we're trapped in sensuous consciousness, and we're not grasping the true universals behind those sensuous axioms. So one is that time and space themselves are sensuous. In the supersensuous realm where pure thought really exists, there's no time or space. So when you have a line, you're automatically assuming that space is necessary, but it's not. That happens not in the supersensuous world. That only happens in the world of nature. But if you're sensuous, you can't make that distinction, so you can't think it through. But because Hegel does think it through, he actually shows that the line, the axiom of the line of the null set, leads back to the supersensuous world, the world of pure universals. Last point, I guess, is where does Hegel start then? If he has a non-revelationary beginning, where does he start? He starts with presuppositionlessness. That means he makes no revelations. He justifies literally everything by saying, okay, let's do the Descartes thing. Let's cancel everything that we think is revealed to us, even our senses, all of that. Cancel literally everything. If you cancel that canceling, you end up at the true beginning as pure being. But pure being is just sheer immediate indeterminacy. It's proven in that what comes before it, what mediates it, what proves it, is literally just the canceling of canceling. So it's a presupposition that is no presupposition. You can't start less than that. If you make any other claim than canceling itself, you are assuming something from the outside coming in. That's revelation. So he says you can't start God or the system of logic at all. The system of logic itself has to start somewhere. How did Aristotle create the syllogism? How did anybody create any axiom in the first place? It was kind of revealed to them. They thought it through. But he says, no, real logic has to start with literally no presuppositions at all. And he says the only thing that can be affirmative out of that canceling is just this sheer immediate indeterminacy that's not saying anything. So then how does logic start with that? Well, you don't say anything about the ineffable. It's the form itself that moves as a whole. That's what a universal is. Pure being is the first abstract universal of pure logic. That's what every atheist should, if they're truly logical, they have to begin with that. Or else you're making some kind of revelation somewhere else and treating science as religion, as a religion in some way based on your sensuousness. So
Yeah,
this is the logical contradiction, is that once you develop this whole, it creates the science of logic that then others itself into repeating itself in nature. That's why when you look at nature empirically, you're just finding the universals because you're just returning. That's why we recognize them in the world. And then it turns into spirit as our explicit recognition of them, as we rebuild that world inside of our sensuous form. So we're sensuous and supersensuous as a mix. And then as it completes itself, it turns into all-knowingness that circles back to create its own being. So the result, so the beginning, the antecedent of logic is pure being that becomes its own result. And then its all-knowing state also becomes indeterminacy again, because all blackness, remember the beginning is all canceling. You cancel everything, it's an absolute negation. Well, you circle back around to the opposite as absolute knowing, which is absolute positivity, where everything is illuminated, where you don't have any distinctions, because everything is just you recognize everything. So if there's nothing that's not you, you return to that oneness that's indeterminate again, but you return to it from the other side of the circle that reconnects you back to the indeterminacy of pure being. And so this kind of completion of the logic happens just with the logic itself. Okay. So he says, this is what God is supposed to be to the atheist. It's the complete, concrete totality of logic. That is what the Bible is trying to talk about when it's saying the Alpha and the Omega, these logical contradictions that you are God and you are not God. You are God. Once you realize that all-knowingness of logic in yourself and you become the perfect atheist, you end up in your opposite, that, oh man, I am the whole thing. But it's like an apotheosis that realizes that there was something before you, which was the absolute logic. You are just rebuilding yourself as perfect reason. And that's why you get the best of atheism and the best of theism at the same time, but you have to think it in this circle of reason. If you don't have the circle of reason, you have revelationary science, religious science.
Okay. Yeah. So some of this stuff I'm still like I'm understanding and there's some clarity. I don't think that I'm going to be able to fill the gaps completely here. So that certainly, thank you for talking about all that and clarifying some things. I think there is some clarification going on, and I can understand what you're saying in a poetic versus a semantic sense. So a pretty big bridge there for me. But just to go to another place here. So the claim again is we can change the world and introduce a new world spirit. And then I'm going to get rid of the in 22 days because I think that's mostly just based off of your circumstances. But I can I essentially say here, we can change the world and introduce a new world spirit if we introduce Hegel's science of logic for God coherence. Is that good enough in terms of the claim? And then, okay, so two pieces of information that I've gotten here that I think are supporting this claim, and you can let me know if I'm wrong. One would be you can notice this pattern in your thought process, but also through observations, or this just through existing, you can kind of notice this reiterative or circular pattern occurring. Is that correct? Okay,
Yeah,
so
everything reasonable is in a circular speculative logic. Yeah,
okay,
but
so
it's in
if
its
we
right order. Mhm.
in the right order, okay, all right.
Yeah, if you
So
don't
if
have the right order, then it's just contradiction, which is what we see in the Bible, and that's what you're using, right? But that's why the order is absolutely essential, and that's like the only thing Hegel really gives that's new is he literally puts those categories in the science of logic in order. That's what we need to
okay,
grasp to overcome the contradictory nature of real pure thought.
okay, so if you can notice this, if you can notice this kind of circular thought process in a specific order, or you notice these states of being or movements, let's say, then we can change the world and introduce a new world spirit. Like the recognition of this thing will bring about this thing called the new world spirit. And this is from the science of logic, and relates to God coherence. This is the idea. Okay. So that would be your reasoning. I'm wondering if you think that it's possible that someone would notice this order. Like, okay, so what would you say to somebody who notices a thought process, or they notice these movements or these features, let's say, of experience that lead them to a different conclusion, that lead them to the conclusion that we can't change the world, that there isn't this new world spirit, and that the way that Hegel describes these categories is incorrect. I'm wondering, how might you respond to that person? It's still going through these processes, but the processes are different than what Hegel's describing.
What I would say is, if you showed, like for me, it comes down to my clarity on communicating, number one. But if we did show that Hegel's categories were in the wrong order, he says that's okay. You're going to sublate me anyway. Some of the things are going to be in the wrong order. So I'm just giving you the outline. You guys have to do it for yourselves and then double check. And he says that's why there's two, I think anyway, there's two models of truth. He says you can't just rely on coherence because you could fall prey to your own cognitive bias. And you can't just rely on correspondence, empiricism. He says when one fails, you do the other. So he says if the logical categories in the science of logic don't explain things in the actual world, like how they're permutating or growing into each other, then they're probably wrong. So you need to reorder those categories to actually explain reality in the pure thought way. But they also need to follow the coherence rule, the dialectical evolution. So you're moving back and forth. And he says, yeah, you're probably going to catch things I missed, but the method, the way that I'm doing this is so new that at least gets us a lot further along than the abstract science and the abstract philosophy we've been doing for 3,000 years. Aristotle was like only the only one that got close to doing what Hegel said needed to happen, because he was a speculative philosopher. He just couldn't rebuild the whole circle, which is why the logic didn't ground itself, and he provided the syllogism in this abstract form, like in just bits that weren't justified. Like he didn't justify the syllogism. He just said, "Here it is. This is what the world looks like it's doing." But what's the foundational pieces of that? Hegel does that for us. He grows the syllogism logically. He justifies logic itself. It's incredible. So I think that if somebody showed me that there's a category that's wrong, I'd be like, well, is the method wrong? And we would just keep moving back and forth to double check that if this is still wrong, but it's better than what we're doing or more coherent than the current science that we're doing, then we should still try and perfect it.
Okay, so then in this, there is this possibility that that the categories aren't exactly correct. I'm wondering. Well, no, let's move on to another one, because another piece of information that I heard you give to some degree, and I've heard other people give in terms of this conversation, was that really you can notice this throughout history as well. You notice these iterations, or you notice this process in history if you look at it. So if we're seeing this in history, then this new world spirit exists, and it can change the world if we would just learn it and implement it, right? So what if historians aren't seeing that process, or they're seeing a different process? I'm wondering if this would change your confidence at all. Like if they're noticing that there may be some patterns in history, but I think it's all that one quote that kind of comes to mind that may pin this down just a little bit more is like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So what if that's really what's going on here, is that it's not that these processes are the same, they just look similar. Would that change your confidence in the claim at all? I'm wondering.
Well, when you're describing that, I'm experiencing coherence. Like I'm remembering that Hegel says that too, and he says
Hmm.
that even though you have this essence, this like repeating fractal pattern that's universal and happening everywhere, he says each version of it is different. So it's actually
Hmm.
happening in its own process. Each dialectical stage is actually a little bit different than the previous one. Its process is different, but its structure is the same. So it says even that dialectic, that's an opposite that he sublates. So even when you're reading his philosophy, he like builds in his philosophy is like anti-fragile. It's like if you find a contradiction he didn't sublate, he gives you the tools to sublate it and put it back into the absolute system. And it's like,
Okay.
whoa. But if you showed something like if you showed an opposite pair that wasn't sublatable, then either one he says that you just need to do more discovery, like your epoch in history just hasn't
Hmm.
discovered enough, or you're bringing in your own baggage and not seeing the dialectical movement purely. You're not keeping the
Is,
categories clear.
just really quick, is it another option here that it's just incorrect? We have two options. One is that there's something that you're missing. I forget what the other one was, but is there any sense here in which this is like just incorrect? Or I guess, let's this I don't remember if I asked this earlier, but what would prove to you that this wasn't correct, or what would lower your confidence? We don't have to completely disprove it, but just what would lower your confidence that it was
If we found phenomena that didn't follow this universal logic of
okay.
negation and sublation, and that the world wasn't organized in opposite pairs, that even that the diversity in life, like people say, oh, the diversity is not opposite pairs, but actually, if you trace down the science of logic, every single concrete structure, even the state, he says, looks like it's not a bunch of opposite pairs, but actually says if you boil it down, yeah, it's like 200 opposite pairs. You just have to build them in their logical order. But if you showed me that doesn't apply to reality or wasn't coherent in itself, then I would have to change my views.
Okay.
And then I suppose Hegel's out of that is like, okay, I invite that in. He says, but it's going to make the world more irrational and less understandable. And maybe the world is completely irrational, but or it might even be a logic that's beyond the reasoning that we have. But he says at
Hmm.
that point you can't speak it, you can't know it, you can't say anything about it. So why talk about it? So he
Okay,
says,
so that is another
if
option
you
though, right? Then it seems like okay, all right. But then we lose coherence and we lose logic at that point.
Yeah, so he says that's kind of the point of truth is that it's rational and you can understand it. So he says he started so fundamentally, he believes that if you try and do anything that's not just a reordering a system, but try and do something radically different, like don't start with presuppositionlessness, start with something affirmative. He says you're already doing something that's contradictory in some way, more contradictory than what he has done. And I can't help but believe, like for me, the reason why I'm following Hegel isn't because like, oh, it's all clear to me. It's that it's just more clear than what I had before, in
Hmm.
that it solved a few more contradictions and made things make sense. That, like when I was, it took 20 years to find this out about Hegel. So I have all these other philosophies that I was turning to for truth, and they were coherent in themselves. And it was that breadth of understanding, that diversity of content, that allowed me to recognize all the coherence in Hegel. Whereas if you don't have that background, you might not recognize it right away. But for me, it'd be hard to introduce a new philosophy that's not one of these other 4,000 that I read in some fragment in Hegel, because he built his system. Like when you read Hegel, you're like reading 115 philosophers. So if you're going to point out a place of incoherence that he hasn't thought about, it's the margins are pretty small. Not that it's impossible, but he's saying you can. It's just that it's probably unlikely, because he took those 115 and put them in that circle of reason. Like Descartes is on there somewhere, Leibniz is on there somewhere, Jesus is on there somewhere, Buddha is on there somewhere, Parmenides is at the beginning, Zeno is in there, Heraclitus is becoming. Like he just says every stage in history can also. He's actually, if you can find a stage in history that doesn't line up with the way the logic moves, he says
Okay.
history is just the same logical order. That's another great way to falsify it, is to find a stage that doesn't line up with the order. If Parmenides is not pure being, like pure universal pure being, okay, what is? If Heraclitus is not pure becoming, okay, then what is? So that's another great way to verify it, because he says it's all the same logic. Even contingent human history has to be a fractal repeat. And I read it and I was like, wow, the history doesn't make perfect sense, but it makes a lot more sense than where I was before. And I think that's an advance in terms of coherence in science.
Yeah, I think that might take the conversation just one more direction that I wanted to go, because I read a lot of the philosophers, and some of them in piecemeal as well. But I certainly get the sense, like if I'm reading Socrates, I get the sense of like pure forms. But I get more than that. Like when I'm reading philosophers, I don't categorize them as directly one thing. I notice that they say a multitude of those things, and they don't fit neatly in any category to me. They maybe fit in that category, but they fit in several others as well. And so that's also making me think about, in terms of this process, this idea that it's going to be hard for me to see this in history, because I will categorize one event or one person in multiple categories on the spectrum,
And that's why what you're
on the loop.
sensing, and we might not get to a sublation because there's a lot here, but I think we've already done enough where the claim is true, where I think people who are seriously looking for the truth will see what we just discussed, like, I've never heard this answer before. And that would be like, okay, most people, like, I've looked at all these other philosophers, and it's like, it's coherent, but it's not fixing the problem between religion and science, politics, and all these things. But this answer I at least haven't heard before, so at least it's worth investigating. And if people start investigating it, and I'm able to keep teaching things, the coherence will start to build. And I think in 22 days, if somebody applies themselves to the 20 or 38 sessions that I did on the internet, if they listen to each one, if they're truly logical, they'll probably end up back at me or point out where my flaw is so that I can sublate it. It just keeps growing.
Okay.
But to answer your question here more directly, so you were saying that, what was your question again? Just repeat it.
It was, if I'm able to fit any event or thought or category or person into multiple things on this loop in
Okay.
these categories, then that seems to me that it's not so ordered, that
Right. They're conflating. Okay, that's why I mentioned the claim is that I'm about to get into the meat and potatoes, or as a vegan, the veganese and potatoes. I'm going to try and explain a little bit of the history. Hegel does this for hundreds of pages, right? 115 philosophers over 3,000 years. To get the coherence and the universality, you just have to watch it being reapplied. Like that's when the model fits, right? Is when you can test it and try and falsify it in different contexts, right? You keep controlled variables the same, you change other things and see if the model still holds. That's kind of what Hegel was doing scientifically with this universal logic and history itself. But to give you an idea concretely, so what you're sensing, that there's this like kind of complexity and this kind of like blurring between philosophers and not like hard categories, Hegel says that's because the categories aren't clear to you. Actually, they are in specific categories, but they're building on each other. So the later philosophers are more complex in a certain way than the previous ones, but the universals are always present. They're always happening. The totality is always absolutely immanent. Everything is actually happening here, but it's either implicit or explicit. And he says, we're already everything. He says, we're just explicating this logic at higher levels of realization. That's all we're doing. It's all always here, either implicitly or explicitly. Absolute spirit is when the idea is fully explicit. Absolute idea, when it's just in the science of logic, is fully implicit to us. So in terms of history, if you don't understand the categories grasped clearly, or you aren't making clear distinctions, you can't separate them while also showing what's the same in them. So it's that speculative nature that they're all doing the same thing but are different. That's the hard thing, to make the conflations into an order. So he says that's what Hegel says he's doing. So he says to really make these more complex philosophers more clear, you have to see what the philosophers before them were doing, and it gets more and more simple as you get further down. And he says that the Oriental, so the history of philosophy sort of kind of begins in religious consciousness, where Buddha and all these divine masters grasped the universals in a totality. They were divine masters. They were seeing the concrete whole. They were seeing some version of God. But when they were communicating it, they weren't communicating it in scientific explicit form. They were just feeling it and using sensuous examples to try and make it explicit. They weren't putting it into a systematic order, at least not the way we think of science today. He says real philosophy begins not with religious consciousness, but with the Eleatics that came after religious consciousness started to sublate itself. So in ancient Greece, he said world spirit was working its way out, and he says that the first pure thought that was made explicit for pure thought was pure being grasped by Parmenides during the period of the Eleatics. So he says that's where contingent human history starts with one universal. There's no more complex explications going on. All the other universals are happening, but they're not explicit in pure thought form. They're in like myths, they're in polytheistic religion, they're in some kind of non-philosophical form. But he says the first one that's not constitutive of any previous ones is pure being, because the Eleatics recognize that pure being always was and pure nothing was never happening. So they only grasp pure being in the one-sided way, but they got that one right. So that's the simplest beginning you can make, where it's clear that they're not constitutive of any previous philosophers. They are the first genuine they're the first philosophers. They don't have the whole system yet. The whole system is what Hegel did. That's why he's the first genuine philosopher. But they're the first philosophers because the universal they grasped was just one. Only one was in pure thought, and that was in its right order. That was pure being. That's the first beginning. But then they discarded all the other thoughts, right, and said those are all garbage. This is the only true thought. So that was the mistake they made, is they couldn't develop pure being into all of its pure forms, right? Zeno comes along and says, hey, look, I can show you a contradiction with this pure being, that pure nothing goes back and forth. It's actually kind of one and the same. There's this weird relationship going on that's contradictory. And you start getting, Hegel says, you can credit Zeno with the pure logical form of dialectic. So he says, you get pure being, and then pure being turns itself into pure nothing through dialectic. And he says that's the role of Zeno in history. He began that and showed it. But he says the truth of those two people, the truth of that supersensuous logic, is actually Heraclitus. Heraclitus comes after and says, hey, look, you're both wrong. It's not pure being and it's not pure nothing. It's actually pure becoming. Everything is flowing. But he didn't concretely connect the first two to his philosophy explicitly. He just started doing that. And the goal was that you have to show pure being and pure nothing belong to each other as this alternating, which he did start to actually approximate. That's why Hegel says that he is kind of credited with pure becoming as the first pure becoming. Is that those are the first three universals that constitute all the ones that come after them. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonists, Descartes, they all have these three inside of their philosophies. That's why it looks like they're doing the conflation. But if you have the first three clear, you know that in his philosophy or Descartes' philosophy, he's actually doing something on top of these. And then you can clarify, well, what is he doing that's extra than these? And it helps you rebuild the system and say, what are they doing that's the same, and what are they doing that's different? And I think if you do it in any other way, you end up in this mess that doesn't connect in any logical order. And it just makes a lot of sense with this coherence, that you're just repeating things in at least a more scientific form than our current explanations of history, which Hegel says is not universal history. It's just paraphrasing the particular events. You're not grasping the underlying logic. And so I think he's the first person in history to really do this in a concrete way that circles back on itself. And it's worth looking into another time to grasp him in the whole and not chop him up into bits, because we're chopped up into bits. I think he gives us something new that's worth looking at.
Okay, yeah, I think that there is a lot of common ground here, which I like. And
you're sensing the universals. It's working.
yeah. I mean, these are things that. Sorry, I have a cat in the background that is scratching at my door. But yeah, there are things that I've thought of before that resonate to me when you say them, and there are still gaps though as well. But thank you for speaking. And I'm wondering, just really quick, we just have this thing of kind of confidence skills, but I am wondering, are you in the same area? Has your confidence increased or decreased throughout the conversation at all? If you could just give me a sense of your confidence levels throughout, or maybe just at the end of the conversation on your claim.
I would probably say I'm probably at, let's say, probably around the 80%. I wouldn't say 90%, but I think we're still in the realm that I think the people who will watch this will say, that hit enough bells that I am going to look into it, maybe ask him a couple of questions and keep the conversation going. And if we keep the conversation going, it will lead to those sessions of spirit. And that's where you can watch it as many times as you need to kind of get over the ordinary way of thinking and like do that abstract negation, like do that absolute negation. That's hard to do for ordinary consciousness. To complete the loop as the absolute of atheism, that's really hard to do as well. To understand the opposition between revelation and axiomatic thinking, or like real justification, that's another hard one that we never think to even question. To actually think of our own thoughts, not about something sensuous, but just of themselves, that's another really hard one. How do you apply science to ordering our own thoughts? You know, our thoughts are like a plant. These things are all counterintuitive. And Hegel says you can't grasp them right away because they're not familiar. So he says you have to tarry with the dialectic. It will take some time. But because you guys are street epistemologists and you have all the abstract principles in your memory already, the bells that I was hitting, like they're there to be hit. Whereas most maybe people who aren't trained with those logical principles, they wouldn't have been able to recognize as deeply that I was hitting those bells on a higher coherence. So the coherence is happening, but it wasn't like an immediate epiphany. I didn't communicate it where we could build those, get the tarrying done immediately. But that's part of the claim. I didn't think it was going to happen today. That's why I said in 22 days, I think if we continue at this rate, you will get it. And you might even get it better than I will. And that's why I still think the claim is correct to 80%, is that if we keep the conversation going, which I hope to have inspired you to at least talk about Hegel in a way you might not have heard of before, and logic in a way you've never heard of before, you get curious, the inner philosopher will come out, the spirit of philosophy will come out, and it will start building.
Great, yeah. No, I think I am interested, and I'll continue to look into it. And I started reading The Science of Logic already. It's probably going to take me some time, but I appreciate you talking with me. And I think in the future, I am still interested in having the conversation. And I think maybe a place to pick up maybe next time is this idea of pure nothingness. That is something that's still eluding me pretty heavily. So I think that's something that maybe we could talk about in the future. But I do appreciate all the time you've given me and your thoughts and your explanations. It's been great.
The pleasure's been mine. 2 hours. Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah.
Appreciate that, guys. Thank you. Keep sublating. Stay free.
All right. Okay. Spirit Man or Mark, it was nice talking to you. And hopefully I will see you in the future.
Take care.
All right. Bye, everybody.